Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
My name is Jake Kurtzer, and on behalf of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, thank you for joining us for this important discussion. I'm grateful to be joined today by my colleagues, Steve Morrison from the CSIS Global Health Policy Center and Dr. Jon Alterman from the CSIS Middle East Program in co-hosting this event and welcoming Ambassador Shea to speak with us. Like many of the contexts we study, Lebanon is facing deep political, economic, and security crises, as well as societal cleavages, all of which have intensified following the August explosion in the port of Beirut, generating greater urgency for robust and coherent international support. Lebanon's tenuous political situation has kept additional financial support from international donors at bay. While historically for the humanitarian community, much of the focus has been on Lebanon as a host country for neighbors from displaced neighbors, last month, we hosted a conversation with a series of advocates for Lebanon's marginalized populations to learn more about the challenges facing the whole of Lebanon. And so today, we're very grateful to have Ambassador Dorothy Shea joining us to share her thoughts on the multifaceted challenges facing Lebanon and the paths forward for international engagement. With that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Steve Morrison, to introduce Ambassador Shea and moderate our conversation. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks so much, Jake, and thanks to Jon Alterman, Senior Vice President, Director of the Middle East Program, for joining me today with this. And a special welcome to Ambassador Dorothy Shea. I'm going to introduce Dorothy in just a moment. This event's part of the CSIS Commission on Strengthening America's Health Security. A year ago, November of 2019, we put out a major report, Ending Crisis and Complacency in Health Security. We put a very heavy thematic emphasis on disordered settings and what that means, where we see increasing frequency of outbreaks and difficulties of access and strategies operationally in coping with these. Lebanon's become a showcase in that. We'll hear much more about that. In the period since February of the pandemic, we've been highly active. I'm not going to go into all the details, but one thing that we've done is have a very active podcast series, the Coronavirus Crisis Update. Dorothy Shea, Ambassador Shea, will be joining us for that later today. We've posted 63 podcasts with over 100,000 downloads since February 24th in that period. I want to thank Michaela Simino on our staff, Christina Hayden, the Public Affairs Office, Embassy of U.S. Embassy in Beirut, and our production personnel, Tyrone Neal, for making this all happen today. We're going to have an interactive conversation, Jon, myself, and Ambassador Shea. Let me just introduce Ambassador Shea, and I know she wants to say a few words before we jump into the discussion. Dorothy has been a Foreign Service officer for 28 years and had a remarkable and sterling career in that period. She was appointed ambassador to Lebanon on February 14th of this year, which I had the pleasure to attend. It was a joyous occasion, attended by the entire Shea clan, among others, and a great battery of friends drawn from across the several generations of accomplished diplomats. She served prior to Beirut. She served as the Deputy Chief of Mission in Cairo, 2014 to 17. We at CSIS had the occasion to interact with her in Cairo on a couple of occasions, particularly on hepatitis C issues. She was the Deputy Consul General prior to that in Jerusalem, 2014, 2017. She also brings deep Africa credentials, served as Nigeria Desk Officer, served in South Africa, wrote a volume as a Council on Foreign Relations Fellow on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. We're really delighted, Dorothy, to have you here as a close friend and colleague and an esteemed diplomat now as ambassador in Beirut. I want to pause for a moment and allow you to offer a few introductory remarks before we move to the substantive discussion. But welcome, thank you.
Great, thank you, Steve, for that introduction. I just want to do a sound check and make sure y'all can hear me. Are we good? If I'm not hearing no, then I'm going to take that as
You're
a yes.
good. We are good.
Okay, thanks. So I want to just say I consider this as something of a homecoming for me because little known fact, and it's not in the bio that Steve Morrison just read from, as a graduate student at Georgetown University far too long ago, I was an intern at CSIS, where I worked for none other than Zbigniew Brzezinski, in whose name Jon Alterman holds the chair for Global Security and Geostrategy. So that's one aspect of homecoming. And I first met Jacob Kurtzer when I worked for his father, Ambassador Dan Kurtzer, who was then the US Ambassador to Israel. I was new to the Middle East and learned so much from him and fell in love with the region and have continued to cross paths with both Dan and his progeny, Jacob, who is very successful in his own right, in both regional and humanitarian circles. And then Steve Morrison, I first met as a desk officer for Nigeria when he was working on the Secretary's policy planning staff covering sub-Saharan Africa. And Steve became something of a mentor, got me interested in the policy planning staff, where I then went on to work as a staff assistant in one of the most interesting jobs I've had in the Foreign Service, and where I developed many lifelong friends, Steve among them. And truly, I am delighted to be here with you all discussing these issues today. And I really appreciate the multidisciplinary approach that you're taking to the issues here in Lebanon. And unpacking it, we've got, first of all, an economic crisis. And, I was using the word crisis, let's say a year ago when I was preparing for my confirmation. That word is now kind of passé, and it seems like we now need to up the ante to something like catastrophe to capture the budget, fiscal, trade, exchange rate disruptions, the corruption, all of which has contributed to a loss of confidence in the Lebanese economy. On top of that, you have the global pandemic, which obviously we'll be talking about a fair amount today, which the authorities did a relatively good job of containing in the early days, but it's now on an unsustainable trajectory. And then there was the horrific August 4th explosion, which destroyed a good part of the city and took out several hospitals with it. It was the last straw for a lot of middle-class Lebanese who are just fed up with corruption and mismanagement of the kind that produced that explosion. And they are now seemingly voting with their feet. And then on top of that, we have political paralysis. The government at the time resigned. We've been in caretaker status for 3 weeks. And there's no real sense of urgency that I can detect to get a new government in place that will be able to take the meaningful decisions on everything from reform, which I can talk about some more, to really tackling the coronavirus pandemic and dealing with digging the country out of this huge hole that it's in. So easy peasy, right? Those are the issues that we are up against, and I look forward to discussing them with you all. Thanks.
Thanks, Dorothy. For our audience, for our remote audience, on your screen is a question button down on the bottom. You're welcome to submit questions and comments, and we'll attempt to weave those into the course of the conversation here today. So, Dorothy, let's talk about the risk of implosion. I mean, you've described this as a catastrophe. It's an accelerating set of interlocking crises that threaten state failure, violent internal instability, worsening health and humanitarian crisis, and destabilization of the surrounding region. And it's a lot of Lebanese themselves and a lot of veteran observers are pointing back to the remarkable resilience of Lebanese people in Lebanese society and asking, have we reached some turning point here where people are exiting, or they're resigning themselves to a certain despair and hopelessness? And so it does seem to be a pretty remarkable and disturbing moment. What's the U.S. strategy of engagement? What's the priorities? What's the level of leadership and commitment from the United States in pressing for some pathway out of this worsening crisis? And what are we hoping for as concrete measures of a way that we might be able to judge that there is some path out?
Yeah, all very good questions. Thank you. And I hope you'll forgive me if I take a step back in answering that question, because in understanding the way forward, I also want to underscore the incredible investment that we've been making in Lebanon for decades now. We have been a committed partner and really working to bolster Lebanon's security, stability, and sovereignty, trying to support sustainable development and help them meet their massive humanitarian needs, while also calling out where they need systemic reform to end corruption. We see a need to help bolster civil society here, strengthening state institutions, and combating the corrosive influence of malign actors like Hezbollah, promoting the rule of law and independence of the judiciary, and helping the up and coming generation by sustained support for quality education, so that when Lebanon's young people, grow up and rise up through the ranks, they will graduate with relevant job skills so that will allow them to succeed in the marketplace. So that's like a broad-based picture of, what our strategic plan has been here for quite some time. But put on top of that, the reality that we're dealing with, and I won't say it all went out the window, but we had to focus on immediate crisis management. In early March, the country defaulted on its Eurobond debt. This was a first. That brought the exchange rate plummeting. And then they got hit with the double whammy of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, just crushing economic circumstances. And you referred to the resilience of the Lebanese people. And there's something remarkable there, because all of this was before August 4th, right? What an incredible, shocking catastrophe that was, taking out a good portion of the city. So, I've been fortunate as a relatively new ambassador on the ground to have incredible support from my leadership. I mean, right from the top, President Trump, Secretary of State Pompeo, the National Security Advisor, our Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs are all people who care about what happens here, who get that Lebanon matters, and who appreciate that we have a lot at stake here for ourselves, for the region, and for the Lebanese people. So you talked about avoiding state failure. That's obviously something that has to be first and foremost. And you also, and I think we'll talk about this later too, the measures for progress. How do we want to hold ourselves accountable for trying to make a difference in Lebanon for the better? Let me just tick through some of the challenges that Lebanon is up against. And I hope this isn't too repetitive from stuff that you already know, but the statistics are pretty shocking. Half of the population is living in poverty, according to the World Bank. That's up from 28% 1 year ago. And 25% of the population are living in extreme poverty. The World Bank predicts that the GDP will contract by 20% in 2020 and probably another 7% next year. The currency has lost more than 80% of its value. So the people are seeing their life savings evaporate given this heavily dollarized society. Inflation is now in overdrive with a staggering 120% increase year on year from September to September. Food prices, even more so, they're up 367%, Lebanon imports 80% of its food. And then if you look at the aftermath of the Beirut blast, that's got to be impacting this next statistic. The price of home furnishings and home goods is up 664% year on year. So, and all of this is aggravated by the lack of an empowered government, which I talked about earlier. And that's exactly what we need, because a caretaker government doesn't have the authority to take meaningful decisions. So there are negotiations that are ongoing, and we wish them success. But how are we going to measure that success? And on the one hand, I would say, let's measure success by how seriously the stakeholders take their responsibility to get on with government formation and implement serious reforms to prevent that worst case scenario that you were painting, Steve. But I say that with some trepidation, because am I really suggesting that I, as the US ambassador or representing the US government, should be holding myself or us responsible for something the Lebanese are really responsible for? Because we can't really want it more than they do. How do we make them want to solve these thorny, difficult, and very difficult to solve problems? So, we've had President Macron pay visits here. He just had a special envoy here this week. Notwithstanding all this high level attention, we had David Hale here, our Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the acting USAID administrator, and David Schenker has made 2 visits here in the past couple months. It's not all about visits, but it's about what you do with, that kind of policy impetus. So we're trying to get them to implement reforms, right? That's another measure of success. There's a whole kind of catalog of reforms that we could hold up and measure success by. And I don't even have to come up with a new list here. This roadmap has been in existence since at least 2018, when the French hosted the CEDR conference. And it includes things like reforming the electricity sector. Many people start out with that as number one, because they are bleeding out money, wasting, subsidizing fuel that isn't even used by Lebanese if it's then re-exported across the border to Syria. But all kinds of inefficiencies are built into that system. Reforming public procurement, conducting audits of the central bank, the finance ministry, and other key sectors to include telecoms, customs, passing a capital controls law and making other reforms to the banking sector, privatizing the Beirut port and airport, and systematic reforms of the customs sector. By our conservative estimate, the government is losing at least $500 million a year in customs revenues that are not collected because of corruption in that sector. Approving legislation to allow the judicial branch to be truly independent. Passing a meaningful budget for next year on time. Organizing parliamentary elections for the following year. So those are all, it's a ready-made list of measures by which we can evaluate progress. And sadly, I don't see a whole lot of progress up until this point. And those are kind of, more or less the same things I would imagine that the IMF is going to be asking for once they have a government in place that has the authority to negotiate with the IMF. But there's another thing that gets to investor confidence, and that is how much is Lebanon able to attract dollars back into this economy? Right now, they're facing a classic crisis in confidence for all the reasons that I described in the past few minutes. But just this week, the central bank governor talked about $10 billion that the Lebanese population has collectively stuffed underneath their mattresses. That's $10 billion that is not working for the economy, that's not being used productively. So just imagine if people had the confidence to be investing domestically, Lebanese themselves, let alone attracting foreign investment. What we could be doing in terms of creating jobs and contributing to the country's GDP, rebuilding sectors that have long since been lost. So those are some thoughts I have, Steve, about that worst case scenario, about trying to avoid it, and on at least how we can think about holding ourselves and, more importantly, the Lebanese accountable.
Thanks so much, Dorothy. I'm going to ask Jon Alterman to jump in right now. Jon?
Thank you very much. And thank you for that comprehensive overview. I've long admired the work of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, and you follow a really distinguished line of U.S. ambassadors who've been incredibly effective diplomats in very difficult situations. It seemed to me that for much of that time, the U.S. strategy toward Lebanon has had as a high priority how to marginalize Hezbollah in Lebanese politics. And that's not worked all that well. Much of the caretaker government was Hezbollah dominated, or at least Hezbollah sympathetic group. And it seems to me that part of the US response to the crises, or whatever the next elevation above crisis is in Lebanon, is to let Lebanon fail a little bit and discredit Hezbollah in the process. And yet it doesn't feel like whatever is happening has discredited Hezbollah, has discredited the sectarian groups, has discredited the sort of Zu'ama and the old confessional leaders in Lebanon who a US strategy of reform would marginalize. What is our strategy toward Hezbollah? At what point do we decide that we need a different strategy in order to move beyond the point where Hezbollah continues to enjoy the support of a large part of the Lebanese population?
Yeah, a fair question. I would say that the strategy is part of the maximum pressure campaign that the administration has been orchestrating against Iran. We really view Hezbollah as a proxy, an arm of Iran in the country. Obviously, they are of and from Lebanon, but their agenda is wholly in service to their Iranian masters. So the pressure campaign is real, and it's been having an effect. I would point to some of the sanctions that we have implemented, for example. And here we have broadened the scope to include not only Hezbollah leaders and figures, but also those who aid and abet and are, very much in union with Hezbollah. So we saw in, I forget, late August or early September, there were some designations of Yusuf Finyanos and Ali Hassan Khalil moving outside the Hezbollah entity itself, but making clear that those who are aiding and abetting and benefiting from those relationships are also vulnerable. And I think that has been noticed. Just this past week, we designated Gibran Bassil. He was designated not on grounds of his relationship with Hezbollah, but rather under the Global Magnitsky Act. And we can talk about that some more too, but there's definitely a tie-in with Hezbollah because we know that that entity operates and benefits from a lack of transparency in the society. A lot of people attribute the whole environment that was pervasive at the port to this kind of, I'll look the other way while you do your dirty transaction, while you look the other way while I do mine. And this kind of business as usual, anything goes mentality that is very much associated with Hezbollah. And they are understood to have the run of the port. So I think there does need to be some accountability and responsibility. And we did see also that there were some questions raised when there was a warehouse that exploded down south in late September without a real suitable explanation. This is in a population area. People lost their lives. So, whether it was a weapons depot or something having to do with missile production, I'm not sure. But I don't think it was what they said it was, which was a warehouse for unexploded ordnance from the 2006 war. And so holding Hezbollah accountable for, when they effectively put people's lives at risk after living through August 4th, how could we not do that? Now, how successful have we been? I think we can all be self-critical about that, because they're, they enjoy some degree of influence, let's say. What we try to do is call them out and call out those who legitimize them. What we haven't done is go so far as some, say, maybe Gulf countries have gone, and to just write off the whole country and say, as long as, Hezbollah is calling the shots, we're not going to have anything to do with y'all. We still think it's really important to invest in those state institutions so that we're not ceding that space to malign actors. So whether it's the Lebanese armed forces, whether it's the judiciary, which I was talking about earlier, there are ways where we can try to deny space, and I think that's really important. Thanks.
Dorothy, I'd like to shift to COVID-19 if we can. Here in the United States, I'm sure you're following the crisis that we face, that we're in a dramatic and very dangerous surge right now. We're over 150,000 cases in a single day. Lebanon's in its own surge, and it's at 100,000 in aggregate since February. We're 150,000 a day. We're at 10.3 million cases, almost 240,000 dead. That's against 100,000 cases in Lebanon and under 800 that have died. So we are struggling as a country with a profound, runaway, uncontrolled pandemic. The upper Midwest, the stories coming out of Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota are just harrowing today. And we're at great risk of our health system breaking down. Governors are starting to resort to extraordinary measures. The government of Utah has declared a state of emergency. We're going to see more of that in the coming days. Now in Lebanon, we're seeing not a dissimilar phenomenon here. And we know that there's a 2-week lockdown that is going to be coming into force this weekend. There's a real sense that this country that was the medical capital of the Middle East is in crisis, and it's seeing mass exodus of its talent, and that the health system's at risk of breaking against this surge that's happening. We had 13,000 in a given week, I believe, last week. In over that, of that 100,000, half of that has been just in the last month. And so this is a grave crisis. There was good performance earlier in the year. Things began to unravel a little over the summer. And then, as we know, the August 4th explosions sort of lifted the lid, and things have taken off since then. Hospitals damaged, 3 destroyed, 3 or 4 damaged. The health capacity is really limited now, and in this setting. And my question to you is, what is the U.S. able to bring to the table at this point? We know that there's the emergency needs, whether we're talking PPE, staff, test kits, reagents, ventilators. There's the response requirements are overwhelming, and we know that there has to be preparations beginning even amidst this crisis for the introduction of vaccines, and that in itself for middle-income countries and low and middle-income countries is a source of great uncertainty. Tell us a little bit about what the U.S. is in a position to do in the midst of this crisis.
Yeah, thank you. We're really concerned, and you reviewed the evolution of the pandemic in Lebanon really well. I would just note that as effective as they were in keeping a lid on it early on, it was because of some pretty draconian measures. They basically shut down the country, including the airport, in those early days, just locked it up. And they were one of the first to stop schooling. Now I would say a fair amount of pandemic fatigue has set in, and maybe a certain amount of resignation and lack of education. So, I think we struggle with some of the same issues, no matter what country we're in, that some of the solutions are so low tech, that if we can just get people educated about how to protect themselves and others, with proper mask wearing, for example. But those aren't usually the go-to solutions. People look for something with more bells and whistles. I was looking at yesterday's World Health Organization report, and this is great. I get this every day from WHO, and they probably have one that came out today, but I just haven't had time to look at my email. They were almost at 2,000 cases a day. I was worried when they were at 600 a day, which is what they hit shortly after the August 4th explosion, because even that already was unsustainable. So you've got the other statistics that you ran through, but one thing is they've got average positivity 14.5%. I don't know how that compares to other places, Steve. People do have the idea, and I defer to medical experts and those of you who follow this more scientifically. They have the idea that there's less morbidity here in Lebanon, and there are a lot of theories about because the population is younger. Some people believe they have a slightly more forgiving strain of it here. There are various theories, but what can we do about it is where you are going with the question. Well, we have been there. We've tried to. We were lucky that there was a supplemental, budget that we were able to tap into for our partner countries around the world. So we got about $40 million that the United States government, through various arms, provided to or through Lebanon, through our military colleagues, to the Lebanese Armed Forces, to trusted partners like the American University in Beirut Medical Center and the Lebanese American University Hospital. Those are two really good partners. And what we did was we helped them develop their own network of other private hospitals so that they could share best practices. Because in the early days, obviously none of any of us knew what we were doing. And they had learned through the hard knocks of life, some tough lessons, and figured a lot of this stuff out that they were then sharing with other private hospitals. We tend to work with these private partners, the Lebanese Red Crescent, also NGOs, because we don't work with the Ministry of Public Health, nor do we generally provide assistance to the government of Lebanon for the reasons that John Alterman was talking about. But certainly the Ministry of Public Health has been one that we've had to avoid because of its affiliation with Hezbollah. So, what else, this is gonna, providing more money, there's not a bottomless pit of cash. So providing more money will require additional appropriations to be made. I don't have anything else in the pipeline, but what we have been able to do is pivot our assistance as much as possible. And USAID, my hat goes off to them because they started doing this from day one. They got it. They understood how devastating this was going to be to the economy. So they started pivoting their programs on private sector engagement. And just to give one example, for example, not to be redundant, they started doing some vocational training focusing on home health care, because that was seen as a obvious growth industry that would be needed in this time of pandemic. Other things have been done to help small businesses even stay afloat, those that otherwise would have gone belly up. They did some really innovative work with some inventors here who have developed a local ventilator that they are trying to bring to market. And USAID worked with them very closely because they can't afford big, expensive ventilators from abroad, and many countries like us aren't able to sell them anyway, necessarily. So we're helping to develop the local talent. There's also been some assistance being paid just to keep the nursing staff getting salaries, because in the economic climate, I talked about how everyone is losing their take-home pay here because of the exchange rate differentials. So just even keeping that incentive for those healthcare workers to keep coming to work has been hugely important. I think I'll leave it at that.
Could I ask, you've described quite movingly the constraints on Lebanese as the economy melts down and as governance fails to rise to the challenges. But there are more than 1 million people who are even more vulnerable than the Lebanese in Lebanon. You have probably more than 1 million Syrians in the country, most of whom feel they can't go home. You have a large number of expatriate domestic workers, many of whom are trapped by their employers who have very few legal protections. What, if anything, is the embassy doing to try to improve conditions for these vulnerable communities? What should other donors be doing? And is there a way that we can lash together efforts to help them with a broader reform effort that the embassy is trying to move forward in Lebanon?
Yeah, thank you for raising that, and you're spot on that that population of refugees is hugely vulnerable, and we are doing a lot to support them. In the last year alone, I think we have provided 300 million in humanitarian assistance. And I wouldn't say that that went exclusively to refugees, but also very much to the impoverished communities where so many of them make their homes in these informal settlements. It's an issue that is near and dear to my heart, so I follow it closely. And just yesterday joined a Zoom call that our refugee coordinator here at the embassy had with our implementing partners, all NGOs that are working locally. And these are people who are at the front lines working with these vulnerable communities. Many of them also are working with the migrants whose employers can no longer afford to pay them in the dollars for which their contracts oblige them to be paid, nor can they even afford to pay their flight home. So some of these migrant workers have been dumped unceremoniously at the offices of the International Organization for Migration and just left there. I mean, it's scandalous, really. So there are, the pandemic has hit these vulnerable communities as well. There have been news stories of like whole apartment buildings that tend to be occupied by migrant workers. And we track the incidence of COVID-19 among the refugee populations as well. We definitely need to be doing as much as we can to support them, but we also need to avoid playing into a narrative that tends to demonize the refugee population in particular in Lebanon. Just over the last 2 days, there was a conference that Syria hosted with the tutelage of the Russians, all trumpeting the return of refugees to Syria. And I will leave it to my colleagues at the State Department to address this, because we have some views on that. But suffice it to say that we and others in the international community care deeply and intend to adhere to international standards when it comes to prefacing returns of refugees on conditions in which they do so in safety and security, voluntarily and in dignity. And it would be misguided at best to try to put the cart before the horse. So but to avoid like feeding tensions that resentments that maybe the refugees are perceived as getting benefits that local populations aren't, we really do bend over backwards to try to show that that is not the case. And to look at all of these vulnerable populations as being populations in need and doing our best to address them. These frontline workers that I talked to on this conference call did talk about increasing needs, pretty dramatic needs. And it does make me worried because we're going to need those needs to be addressed from somewhere, and it can't just be from the United States. And every country in the world is facing economic recession basically right now because of the pandemic. So trying to figure out how to get the most out of our foreign assistance is hugely critical. And that's where I want to come back to the final part of your question, Jonathan, and that was, how can we tie this in with reform elements? Because, that's the ticket to sustainability. And, one way is to look at, livelihoods for refugees so that they can provide a bit for their own, so they're not just looking for handouts. So if they have the freedom to develop some skills that will help them put food on the table, so much the better. So that's where the skills development is, something that we can't leave aside. Whether school's in session or not, USAID, I talked about how they've been pretty smartly pivoting. They also pivoted to distance learning pretty quickly. So working with teachers to figure out how to conquer this beast that is distance learning, and doing so in a country where you have routine power outages and the internet is not always stable. Looking at things like food security for the whole country, and looking at some of the distortions in the economy that contribute to the sky high inflation that I talked about earlier. The government isn't subsidizing all the right things. Some of the products that they're subsidizing aren't, fuel, for example. Many middle class and upper middle class people, let alone the upper class, are benefiting from a subsidy that they don't need. So how can the government better tailor its assistance to help the poorest of the poor without bleeding out money that it can ill afford, especially for a product like fuel that is easily transported across the border? I think I've been talking too much, so I'll end it there.
Dorothy, can I bring the conversation back a little bit to the question of U.S. influence and leverage in this situation and the broader environment? We've had the realignment, Israel's realignment with the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan. We've had the history, the legacy of the U.S. operating in concert with the French and international institutions like the IMF when it comes to matters within Lebanon. And now we have our own election outcome in Washington. So how are these things in combination coming into play in the influence and engagement the United States has? I mean, has the Israeli realignment and the role that the Trump administration's played in supporting that, has that redounded to your benefit in the ability to try and navigate this crisis?
Well, the Abraham Accords certainly made a big splash in the Middle East. There's no question. And those who are, really open-minded, broad thinking will admit that it's a game changer. However, the sensitivity of, the person on the street who still views Israel as the enemy, they are technically in a state of war, is going to be enduring. So I think it'll take a little time for people to absorb what this game changer means for Lebanon. But interestingly, not related necessarily, but we've had the resumption of maritime delineation talks between Lebanon and Israel under our auspices as mediator and hosted by our UN friends at Nakura down south. So we've had about 4 rounds of talks in the past several weeks. And these are not peace talks. These are not normalization, but both countries, Lebanon and Israel, have an interest in getting some definition on that maritime boundary.
This is all about natural gas fields and future development prospects.
Absolutely. And Lebanon, more than anything else, needs some glimmer of hope for its economy. And this is about the only thing out there right now that's giving that. Nobody knows what is out there in those gas fields. They had been exploring a block up until just a few months ago that came back with some less than promising results. But Block 9 looks like a big prize down there closer to that border area. And so they have a very definite interest in being able to explore and potentially exploit whatever might be out there. So that's one bit of positive influence the United States has had. I mentioned the sanctions. I mean, that's unquestionably another kind of influence that we have been exerting in Lebanon and beyond. And you know, for better or for worse, there are some people who are very grateful because they feel like they need the stick of sanctions to help get this endemic corruption in check. And then, of course, there are others who view this as interference and unwelcome, not least of which would be those who have been targeted by the sanctions themselves. But that's, you know, unquestionably there. You know, but I think the Lebanese people have been appreciative of the role of the United States in their society. We have been talking for quite some time now about how, for us, when we stand with Lebanon, we're really standing with the people. It's not about the government, because as Jonathan Alterman pointed out, you know, this last government was put together, you know, under the tutelage of Hezbollah, and they were the first to congratulate them. So this was not a government that we wanted to be closely associated with. We'll see how the next government looks, but definitely standing with the people. And, you know, there's no shortage of interest in people, you know, when the circumstances allow, getting back into US universities for their children, exploring business ties with the United States, appreciating the values that we stand for, all of that kind of soft power. And, you know, that whole expatriate Lebanese American community that's out there, super successful, super impactful in the various fields in which they live and work. They also have been a huge tie between our two countries. And they came through in a huge way after the August 4th explosion, with all kinds of in-kind donations, including, I might point out, cancer medications, because there were 2 containers of cancer meds that went up in that blast and left the country with very little. Thanks.
Thanks, Dorothy. John, I know you've got more you'd like to add. We also want to add a few questions from our audience. We may get interrupted by a temporary power outage at your end, Dorothy, for a couple minutes at the top of the hour. I just want to warn our audience, we may be interrupted for just a couple minutes. If you're able to go a little bit beyond the hour, but over to John.
Thank you. You talked about sort of the international support. You talked about sanctions, which are principally driven by the US. Could you talk about on what issues the US is finding a lot of international support with Lebanon? And importantly to me, what are the issues the US really wants to get more international support on, both in punitive terms, but also in relief terms? What's our agenda for change on the international support side for our policy?
Yeah, fortunately, the international community, or in particular, the international donor community, has very much been in lockstep with respect to Lebanon, that there will be no bailout of the government. I mean, they've gotten themselves into this huge hole of debt, and it's the result of decades of financial mismanagement and corruption. And, you know, there have been efforts in the past to course correct, and the international donor community has made quite generous infusions of cash. But funnily enough, that reform didn't always follow through with those donations. So we got smart at CEDRA and said, okay, now it's going to be a step-by-step approach. So as you make this reform, the donors will make this kind of projectized assistance available, step by step. No free lunch. And I think it's really important that we maintain that real strict conditionality. I have no doubt that the IMF will share that view if and when it comes to having an IMF program. But, you know, sometimes our heartstrings get pulled, or our concerns about that worst case scenario that we talked about could prompt us to second guess ourselves. Like, are we really willing to risk, you know, complete implosion because they haven't put in place these reforms? And you know what? I think we've got to stick to our guns, because if we don't, they will not do the reforms. You know, they have a proven track record of not doing these hard steps. So that's number one, both for ourselves and for our international partners. We have the International Support Group for Lebanon, which meets from time to time under the UN auspices. And that includes the P5 members of the Security Council and a few other key donors. And I think, you know, in that forum, it's also really important to keep the kind of feet to the fire, so to speak. If they don't feel the sense of urgency to form a government, you know, how can we keep that pressure on them? So I think there's a lot of desire to do good here, but I keep coming back to that point I made earlier, that we can't want it more than they do, you know? And, you know, as long as there are people kind of sitting back saying, you know, try to make us reform, just try, it'll be fun watching you, you know, what are we supposed to do? Well, you know, there is that kind of, you know, popular anger that is still out there. I think the protesters might have a bit of protest fatigue. That's fine and understandable under the circumstances, and COVID has a role in that. But maybe, like, just, you know, thinking through, how did they translate what is kind of a righteous anger over their loss of their life savings, over the endemic corruption, the lack of services? How do they translate that, you know, which was remarkable on its cross-sectarian basis? But they never quite managed to turn that into, leverage it into change, to enduring political impact. And again, it's not for us to figure that out for them, but maybe just thinking through what that might look like.
Dorothy, can I bring forward a question? I know we may hit an interruption here, but we have a question from Henri Barkey, a mutual friend of all of ours. The Lebanese crisis is also unique because of the civil war next door. Syria and its regime's first and foremost priority is survival. Can you talk about what it is they are doing in Lebanon that prevents a resolution of the political crisis there?
You know, I've blamed a lot of people on the political paralysis in Lebanon, and Syria hasn't been at the top of my list, but that's not to say that there's not a role. You know, one thing that just, drives a lot of Lebanese crazy is this sense of, I've referred to it a couple of times now, but, subsidized fuel, subsidized medicines, just going across the border. So they feel used, I guess, is the way to put it. I think, Lebanon is also, collectively, the folks here are just, they look across the border and they're nervous about the potential for ISIS, for violence. So, they need to shore up their borders. And, ISIS has tried to be resurgent in Lebanon. We saw that there was a confrontation between the Lebanese armed forces and an ISIS cell several weeks back up north. So that's not something that anyone can be complacent about. There's really just this kind of looming sense of wariness about the Syrians, and a sense that, they've got Israel to their south and Syria everywhere else, and their Mediterranean off to the west doesn't leave them much in the way of options. So the other thing I will point out was that got the attention of Lebanese policymakers and opinion makers was the Caesar Act, which also carries sanctions to prevent the Assad regime from continuing to accrue the funding that would allow him to perpetuate his war against Syrian civilians. But Lebanon looked at that and they were like, well, how else are we supposed to export our goods? Our port was just blown up. We don't have relations with Israel, So just dealing with the geopolitics of, the geography, let's say. I may not have answered your question completely, Henri. I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are too. Maybe,
Thank you.
Maybe Jon.
Over to Jon. We have a great question from one of our audience members. Jon?
Another mutual friend of ours, Patrick Garvey, asks the question: what can we, sort of the broad community in Washington, Congress and think tanks and other government agencies, what can people do to help you? You're taking on an enormously difficult, complicated task. The stakes are high. What else do you need from Washington, broadly conceived, to help you do what you need to do?
Thank you, Patrick Garvey. I'll pay you later for that question because, what I need is attention. And I'm really gratified that I've had it. As a US ambassador, when August 4th hit and, this whole place was up in smoke, I was on the phone with policymakers, every night for God knows how many weeks. And they were putting at my disposal resources from the US government. We had military planes on the ground in 48 hours, full of humanitarian assistance. That was incredibly gratifying and it made a difference and it was visible. And it's much more than soft power, but I'll chalk it up for this point, for these purposes, to soft power. I need continuing attention because you all know that there are bandwidth issues and there's so many problems in the world. But this place really does matter and getting it right matters. And that's going to require more investment. It's not so easy to just rub two nickels together and get a, really professional Lebanese armed forces. Now, I'm prepared to do what Congress wants me to do, which is to also hold the Lebanese armed forces, the LAF, accountable and make sure that every tax dollar that we spend is being spent wisely. But we need to have that national level institution for Lebanon's security, stability, and sovereignty. Because if you don't have an institution like that, guess who's going to fill in the void? We definitely need to help, there's still incredible unmet needs after that blast. And, I've soaked up as, much as I could of immediate humanitarian assistance. I don't know where, if any, next tranche of humanitarian assistance is going to be coming from, but there's still, hundreds of people without windows, and winter's very quickly approaching, so that's a huge preoccupation for me. So just your attention is awesome, and I thank you for it. Every chance I get to talk to members of Congress and their staffs, I take advantage of it. When travel allows, I want to bring them out here so they see with their own eyes what's going on. Those are some ideas.
Thanks, Dorothy. We're getting to the end of our time here today. I think everybody here joins me in thanking you for your service to our country and for the leadership that you're showing there in such a fraught and complicated situation, and the generosity you've shown us this afternoon in your time, in really being so candid and so open to covering this whole spectrum of issues. So we wish you the best. We thank you, and we'll revisit this again. We promise to meet your appeal that you need more attention from Washington, at least from our corner. We'll continue to do that. Thank you.